Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Chain Reaction.
Persistent reports indicate that the Trump administration will de-emphasize the U.S. commitment to European security in favor of an emphasis on defending the U.S. homeland and shifting resources to the Indo-Pacific. This follows a long-running critique of America's European allies for investing too little in their own defense. A critique that predates both Trump administrations, but one that has gotten louder, especially in the second Trump administration. But what is the view in European capitals of the emerging U.S. policy toward Europe, and what might its effects be on transatlantic relations? To discuss these questions, I'm joined today by Dr. Michael Neiberg, who recently returned from a 2-week trip to Estonia and Germany, where he and his Army War College students met with government officials as well as representatives of the business community, the academic community, and civil society. Dr. Michael S. Neiberg is professor of history and chair of war studies at the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. His published work specializes on the First and Second World Wars in global context. His book Potsdam, The End of World War II and the Remaking of Europe, won the Harry Truman Prize. The Wall Street Journal named his book Dance of the Furies, Europe in the Outbreak of World War I, one of the 5 best books ever written about that war. His latest book is When France Fell, The Vichy Crisis and the Fate of the Anglo-American Relationship, which won the 2022 Society for Military History Book Prize. Mike Neiberg, thank you for joining me today on Chain Reaction.
Thanks, Bob. Always great to talk to you.
So you just got back from a 2-week trip with your Army War College students to Estonia and Germany and had 2 weeks worth of discussions with not only U.S. diplomats in the embassies there, I'm sure, but with our allies and partners, representatives of the government, media, think tanks. So what are you hearing from those two countries?
I would say the two most important themes that we're hearing, especially in Estonia, the phrase that several people used with us is that all of the signs are pointing towards stability, but it doesn't feel that way. And the reason for that is that most of Russian forces, most of Russian assets are currently in Ukraine. So this ties to the second major theme we heard, was that if you get the wrong type of ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia, it could vastly benefit Russia by allowing the Russians to redeploy military forces all up and down the front line, everywhere from Estonia all the way down to Romania, Bulgaria, and that's going to put an awful lot of pressure on European allies to react. Because so far, for the last decade or so, the Western European allies and NATO allies have been reacting more than being proactive, and they're worried about getting back into that kind of a cycle. So bottom line, there's a lot of anxiety and there's a lot of concern about what a ceasefire might do and how it might change the strategic picture in Europe.
Yeah, so and I'm sure there's the uncertainty and maybe the nervousness is heightened by the fact that not only are the Baltics small countries, but they are also leaders in support to Ukraine. In Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, many of those countries have sent almost all of some types of equipment they have, Javelin missiles, for instance, to Ukraine. So yes, they're covered by NATO's Article 5, but their conventional military status is weaker now probably than it was before the war. But of course, I think as you alluded to, so is Russia's across the border because they have so many forces deployed in Ukraine. But so when they say the wrong type of ceasefire, what do they mean? I assume they mean for their own security, right? That Russia could then would have surplus forces that it could redeploy from Ukraine. But what's their opinion on what's the right ceasefire for Ukraine itself? Did you get into those discussions?
We did. I think everybody agrees that Ukraine needs a break. It needs peace. It needs an opportunity to rest and recover. The concern is, I think, probably twofold. One, I don't think there's a lot of confidence among anybody that we talk to that Russia is going to stick to whatever terms it agrees to in any kind of a ceasefire. So how do you you provide guarantees that when Russia oversteps the bounds of whatever's agreed to, that there will be real consequences? And I don't think anyone has figured out what that might look like. The second problem, as you noted, Estonia is a very small country. It's about a quarter the size of Greater Philadelphia in population, in a place that's about the size of West Virginia, a little bit smaller than West Virginia. So it has a lot of land, but it doesn't have a lot of people. What it needs is time to begin to adjust, as all of Europe does, to the new political reality and the new economic reality. The political will seems to be there in France, in Germany, in Sweden, in Finland, in Estonia, but they're going to need time to build an industrial base, to figure out what a strategy looks like, figure out what the right kind of coalition arrangements are going to be, and all of that is going to take time. So I think the key resource now is no longer money. I think it's time.
Did you get into any discussions of this proposed Baltic defense line? This is something that all three Baltic countries are talking about, sort of collaborating, a almost Maginot Line type series of fortifications and trenches and things along the Russian border. Was there discussion of that, and what's their attitude toward it in Estonia?
There is a lot of concern that once Russia grabs a piece of territory out of a Baltic state, it will be very, very difficult to get them out. So you almost have to win the fight on the border, or else you're already kind of on your back foot. What was interesting to me, and you've been to these places much more than I have, the Estonians, it seems to me, have more faith going forward in an alliance working with what looks like their natural geographic partners, who are in fact Sweden and Finland, more than they are Latvia and Lithuania, and that the cooperation between the three Baltic states may actually diverge because they do have different interests. And because of the way that the enhanced forward presence works with NATO, they have different alliance partners, so that Lithuania is very much more tied to Poland than it is to Estonia. In the same way, Estonia is more tied to Finland and Sweden than it is to Latvia. So I think that will be a challenge in figuring out how to defend what they call the three Bs, the three Baltic states. They are thinking instead of a kind of regional Northern Europe, almost kind of Nordic way of tying those states together.
Yeah, and so it's interesting, since you brought Poland into the discussion, I think that's a natural segue to this enhanced forward presence battle group discussion, right? The three Baltic countries and Poland were the first four countries that had so NATO forces not from those countries deployed to them as a deterrent force after the Russian intervention in Ukraine, seizure of Crimea in early 2014. So the Polish battle group is led by the U.S. And of course, it's been in the news a lot lately, rumors of a U.S. withdrawal or pullout from Europe. Is that something that people in Estonia and the other Baltics are discussing, and what's their attitude toward that?
Yeah, quite obviously, they don't want to see a rapid decline of U.S. power or U.S. presence. What I think everybody we talk to in Europe, in Germany and Estonia, recognizes is that it is long past time for the Europeans to start spending more on defense. The phrase is going from burden sharing to burden shifting. I'm not 100% clear what the distinction between those two terms is, but the idea is that as the United States hopefully slowly reduces its presence in Europe, it will do so coordinated with European states, so that as they build a capability, we can decline that capability. And then, of course, there will always be certain capabilities that the United States can provide that the Europeans can't, at least for the foreseeable future. So the hope is that the United States, if it leaves Europe, if it declines its force presence in Europe, will do so slowly enough so that there's not a gap between what the Europeans can do right now and what they can do in, say, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So it's really a question of timing and getting this right. We heard a lot of assurances, both from the Estonians, the Germans, the Americans, that there is no real desire to give up on Article 5, to give up on NATO. But the clear signal that the administration, of course, is sending is that defense of the homeland is priority 1, Indo-PACOM is priority 2. Europe is simply going to have to get better at this and get better at this quickly. And again, I think the vast majority of Europeans I've spoken to, not only on this trip, but in other trips to Europe, they certainly recognize that this is well past due. They should have been doing this 10 years ago. The question now is just timing and making sure that this doesn't happen in a way that gives Russia an opportunity to exploit a seam or a gap in European preparation.
Right, right. So, yeah, I mean, as you know, this is a long-running discussion between the U.S. And its European partners about military spending and capabilities. I remember over 20 years ago when I was an exchange student at the German Armed Forces Staff College, we had a U.S. Army Corps commander three-star general, come talk and admonish the Germans. This is in like 2002, I think, for spending too little on their own defense and making too few capabilities available to NATO. So this is a long-running discussion.
Yeah.
You're right. The first Trump administration pushed hard. My argument is that the actual father of European strategic autonomy and increased defense spending is not Donald Trump, but Vladimir Putin, because it was the
no
2022
doubt.
Ukraine invasion that really caused our European partners to react and to raise their defense spending.
We had an interesting discussion, two interesting discussions that I wouldn't say got heated, but got rather direct, one in Berlin, one in Estonia, one in which one American student asked the question, why was it Donald Trump's election in 2024 and not Putin's invasion of Crimea in 2014 that shook you to spend more? And that led to a very interesting discussion. The other one that I really liked, there was a discussion from a senior European defense official who said, look, we want to do more, but don't you know how hard this is? To which an American responded, yes, we know how hard it is. We're the ones who have been doing it. So, this is just to say there is an awareness that both on the European side and on the American side that, as you said, for decades we've been talking about Europe stepping up. Now you're seeing it. Estonia is going to go to 5, maybe 7% on defense. Germany broke this taboo of debt spending, this debt break that they decided to do, 1% of GDP. France is going to about double the size of its land forces. Britain's going to increase. So the money is coming. The real problems are the defense industrial base, which just isn't ready for this either in the US or in Europe. And again, this question of timing and just making sure that we synchronize these transitions in such a way that it doesn't create an exposure or a liability.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So if I'm correct, this was your first visit to Estonia, is that right?
It was.
What any just general impressions or anything that surprised you about it?
What I really love, it's a very small place, as I said. They figure their force multiplier is the education of their people, and they're the most cyber connected people in the world. You can get married, divorce, sell real estate, whatever you want online. You basically have an ID card with a chip and a PIN number, and you and your partner can just both go into the computer system and just log in that you're married, and it's done. And what they're trying to do is reduce the size of their bureaucracy, obviously, so that they don't need to put more people into jobs that are not defense related. And the way that everything in that society, much like you see in Finland, to a lesser extent what you see in Norway and Sweden, everything is designed so that the defense of the country is not just the responsibility of people in uniform, it is a whole of society approach. And I think the other thing that really struck me is their historical memory. One Estonian colonel said to me, we get invaded by the Russians on a sort of regular basis. We're overdue for another one, and we expect that it's coming. So that kind of historical memory is something that is it is palpable when you're in a place and harder to read when you're not in a place. The same thing as I know you've experienced is true in Warsaw, where you can't get away from the way that history is shaping the way that they're thinking about the future.
Well, that comment that we get invaded regularly by the Russians and we're sort of due is I hadn't heard that, and I've been to Estonia plenty of times, but yeah, it must be like living next to a volcano or living on a fault line, right? You don't know when it's going to erupt or when the fault line is going to shift and cause an earthquake, but it does.
Yeah, the metaphor they used was that the bear has returned to the forest. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the bear is going to come into your backyard and try to eat your children, but it does mean that you need to be vigilant, you need to be aware, and you have to have the proper tools. So, one of the questions going forward is what is the right mixture of deterrence in a post-Ukraine war, post-ceasefire kind of arrangement? Is it the standard kind of deterrence by denial where you make Russia aware that if it attacks Estonia, it is attacking a lot of other countries as well? Or do you need some sort of deterrent by punishment where there would be a capability for the Baltic states to at least threaten the ability to hit Russian targets as a kind of response? So, depending on which way you sit in this will depend upon the kinds of weapon systems that you want to build, the kind of doctrine that you're going to build, all of that. So we're dealing with some very, very fundamental strategic questions that Estonia is asking itself. And it's too small to get to the answers by itself, but it certainly can play a role in shaping the questions.
Your comment about e-government and sort of that one of those things you don't really know until you go there and see. It's really interesting. And it's also, I think, a great argument for this type of research, whether it's Army War College students or just, academic scholars, government officials, being on the ground, whether it's field research or a visit like you guys just did, but being on the ground in the region, the things that happen outside of the official meetings, the walking around, the driving around, the talking to people, I think is so valuable for understanding the context of places where, we potentially would deploy military force. In the case of Army War College students, it's good for them to understand that.
No doubt. If I could just the phrase
Yeah.
that I love, if you don't go, you don't know. And
Yeah.
like you said, it's some of those informal. We had a meeting with one of the German think tanks over beer and pretzels that I think gave us more of an insight into what was going on because they weren't giving formal presentations. We had an opportunity to have an exchange. And they're just the kinds of experiences you don't get any other way. And the building we were in had been owned by a Jewish family before World War II. It was seized by the Nazis, given to Yugoslavia as an embassy, then taken over by Alfred Rosenberg, one of the great Nazi ideologues who was executed at Nuremberg, I think. And then the house was given back to the original owners after the war and then turned over to this think tank. And you're in this building with all of this kind of sitting over you, literally sitting over you as you're doing this. And it does give you an appreciation. I think it's Churchill who said it, that Europe has produced more history than it can digest. And you do kind of get the sense of how people are intellectually trying to deal with that and how that affects the way they think about security. And you're 100% right. You cannot do that from Carlisle, Pennsylvania. You have to be present in the place.
Yeah, and that the comment that Europe has produced more history than it can digest is probably something that we in the United States should remember. All of us essentially have grown up with a stable, peaceful, prosperous Europe and a strong Euro-Atlantic relationship, and I think we've taken it for granted. Our conversations with our allies and partners about defense spending, and I'm one of the people who thinks we need to move beyond the percentage of GDP marker for your commitment to NATO, because it's less about that, and the question should be, what capabilities can you make available to NATO now and on a sort of permanent basis, and not what do you spend on defense as a percentage of your GDP. It was good in 2014 when at the Wales Summit when NATO put that marker on the wall, but this is one thing I think I agree with Donald Trump on, that it has outlived its usefulness. And because, and the other reason, and Americans hate it when I say this, it's a little unfair to our European partners to make that comparison because we spend about 3.5% on defense, but we're the only global power in NATO, right? The U.S. is the only global power in NATO. Maybe the UK, France, possibly, I would call them global light. But I say that because that 3.5% is never and never will be available exclusively to NATO, because even if there were a major land war in Europe, the U.S. still has interests it has to protect in the Middle East, in Africa, in the Indo-Pacific, in the Western Hemisphere. So all 11, or I think it's 11, all 11 U.S. carriers will never be available. All bomber and fighter wings will never be available. All Army divisions and corps will never be available to NATO. So comparing 3.5% of U.S. to 2.5% of country X, to me, is just not really a fair comparison.
I agree with you 100%. This may be what the administration means, or what NATO means, by changing from burden sharing to burden shifting. So it may be that you ask state A to provide these capabilities and you ask state B to provide these capabilities, but you're not asking everybody to sort of contribute exactly the same kind of thing. Then the 2% was always just a proxy. And I think what we realize now is it was the wrong proxy. And the number is way too small for the geopolitical reality that we're living in. And if I can just say one more thing, Bob, I think you're absolutely right in that we have always understood a Europe that is, as George H.W. Bush said, whole, prosperous, and free, or whichever way that he framed that. But the Europeans, of course, and I'm an historian of the two world wars, know that this is not necessarily the natural state of affairs. So the question is, how do you build a system and a structure that is going to make sure that we don't go back down the horrific path that Europe has done not once but twice in the 20th century?
Yeah. There's a really good series of Congressional Research Service reports on U.S. national security strategy, I think, and they just come out. I think they update them every year or so. But one of them I read a couple years back made a point that I use all the time, and the author said, given the size, population, and concentration of resources in greater Europe or Europe and Eurasia, the emergence of a hegemonic power there would be a grave threat to U.S. national security interests. That's sort of point one. Point two is Europe has not been reliably self-regulating in preventing the emergence of a hegemonic power without U.S. engagement, right? So that's something I really think I understand the logic of the rebalance to the Indo-Pacific region, but I think we need to keep those two things in our minds as we do that.
I agree. I think the way the president of Poland, Donald Tusk, mentioned it, he said 500 million Europeans cannot forever ask 300 million Americans to protect them from 150 million Russians. Right? That's a fair formulation, but it remains true that the United States set this system up so that we would play this dominant role. It is not the case that the United States has done this solely because the Europeans weren't willing to do it. That's been a huge part of it. But the U.S. has had a tremendous advantage security-wise in promoting democracy and promoting values by having a strong U.S. presence in Europe. And issues have come up about whether the United States would be willing, if it's going to withdraw from Europe, to allow the Supreme Allied Commander, the SACEUR, the head military officer in NATO, would we be willing to let that person be from a non-U.S. State? Would we be willing to allow France to take over from the U.S. in this kind of extended deterrence? And the sense that you get is we're not willing to do it because we are aware of the benefits that power accrues to the United States. So like you, like many of our colleagues here in Root Hall where I'm sitting, we tend to think of ourselves as sort of transatlanticists, where we see these bonds as being something that is valuable, it's worth investing in, it's worth fighting for, it's worth making sure that we don't lose that, even if it's going to require some burden balancing and some reduction of U.S. effort in Europe.
Yeah, no, that's an absolutely fair point. One more Estonian question before we switch to Germany. Was there any discussion of the situation in Eastern Estonia with the Russian-speaking population around Narva, along the Russian border? What's the situation out there, and what's the Estonian government? What's their approach to the issues out there?
So we didn't go out there, so I'm hearing this secondhand from the Estonians. But their view was most younger Estonians who speak Russian want to be Europeans. They want to be in the European Union. They have very little interest in living under Vladimir Putin. There is an older section that has some fond memories of Russia, but they don't particularly want to live under Putin either. So the feeling is, yes, they're ethnic Russian, and yes, they speak Russian, and there may be a small minority among them that would assist Russia, but the vast majority are in Estonia because they'd rather be in the European Union than live under Vladimir Putin. So I didn't get the sense that there was a great fear or a great sense of uncertainty or a great worry that they are disloyal to the Estonian state. I got more of a sense of, we know there's a few individuals we need to keep an eye on, but we don't think this is a systemic problem.
Good. Well, that's good to hear, because periodically you'll hear, is Narva next, right?
Right.
And now you've been hearing that. People have been hearing that since the early 1990s, and it hasn't been next, and hopefully it won't.
It's still possible that Putin would use the presence of a Russian minority population, whether they want to support him or not, as an excuse, the way he did in Donetsk and in Crimea and in other parts of Europe as well. But the Estonians don't think that the Russian-speaking Estonians who live there would play an active role in helping him do that. Good.
Well, that's good to hear. Switching to Germany. So you mentioned sort of the sense of history above you and all around you in Germany, but what were your impressions of that visit? You go there pretty often, so unlike Estonia, this was not a new country for you. But what's new for you in Germany now?
I think what's new is the political will. This new coalition. Two things are going on. I think one is the new political coalition. The CDU is back in. That's Angela Merkel's party. They are in an alliance with the Bavarian Conservative Party, and they have the political will now to spend more money to get companies like Rheinmetall, the big German defense contractor, up and going. Rheinmetall will soon be a bigger company in terms of number of employees than Volkswagen, which is a remarkable thing to think about. So there are economic and defense incentives that are working in Germany that I have not seen in the past. But the second is this looming shadow, which is the far-right Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, whose support comes almost exclusively from the former East Germany. If you take an election map and you overlay it with the borders of East Germany to West Germany, it's an almost one-for-one fit, which is another stunning example in my mind of the importance of understanding history and historical narratives and the way people think about and write about and talk about their past. So I think that the sense is that the German political will is there. The German political system recognizes the need to make some major fundamental changes in the way they do business. But the only concern, if there is a concern looming in the shadow, is that Germany's neighbors and Germany itself don't want to build a powerful Germany and then see the AfD come into some sort of a coalition. Right now, there is a sort of taboo in place that nobody will form a coalition with the AfD, but who knows what the future will hold. So you see that for sure in Germany, but one thing you definitely see is a continuation of Germany's belief that it wants to act only through multilateral organizations, and it wants to be, as they put it, we want to be the helpful second. They don't want to be the nation that's out leading. And we can talk more about this, but I actually think this comes more from German unification than it does from memories of the Second World War, though that's certainly there as well. So Germany has a very complex history, as you know. I think they're starting to realize that this is now about the protection of Germany and Germans. It's no longer about sending Germans to a place like Afghanistan or someplace to protect other people. It's now about the fundamental security of Germans.
You piqued my interest in a couple of things. So first of all, you mentioned that the AfD, the sort of far right populist party, their support comes almost exclusively from what used to be the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. As a historian, what would your explanation be for that?
I've asked metaphorically 1,000 Germans this question, and I get a bunch of different answers. One answer is that this is a generation that was raised on sort of anti-Western messages, and that Germany is different from, say, Estonia, which also got those messages. But Germany is different because it was a divided Germany, and it had this East Germany is built on the theory that it's not West Germany, that dangers come from the West in a way that is more complicated in Germany than it is in, say, Poland or Romania, because of the way that Germany is divided at the end of the war and the way that the Russians treated Germany. It's also the case that East Germany just simply 30 some plus years later, with all the billions of euros that Germany has invested in the East, it is still far behind the West in terms of economic development, jobs, employment, all of that kind of stuff. It's still way, way behind. And there's some thought among Germans that the AfD vote is a statement against the West German system, which just hasn't been able to figure out a way to get East Germany up to the same economic and social level that the West has had. I do think there's also a kind of suspicion that the AfD is tapping into, that the dreams of German unification, apart from the economics, just have not produced the kind of Germany that people were expecting. So, as you know, this is part of a general right-leaning anti-democratic trend in Europe anyway. Marine Le Pen's movement in France, Orban in Hungary. So it's not distinct to Germany, but for listeners out there, just Google the results of the 2025 election. It looks like you're looking at a map of Cold War Germany. It's really, really shocking to see.
Yeah, it is stunning. It does look like, all those districts, east of the Oder River in the former GDR are the hotbed of AfD support. So let me ask you, so Germany, of course, was one of the leaders, if not the leader, in the policy of economic integration of Russia, right? Premised on the idea that by building strong economic ties with Russia, post-Soviet Russia, you could incentivize it to sort of play by the rules of European security, political and economic rules. That obviously has not worked. So is there an acknowledgement in Germany now that was a failure? And what's the attitude of the policy toward Russia now?
Yeah, there's absolutely an awareness that they made three fundamental decisions in the period of German unification that have all three proven to be misguided. One is that as you said, that through trade with Russia, especially the buying of cheap Russian energy, you could make Russia a quote unquote normal state. Second, that you could do something similar with a deep engagement with China. And third, that the U.S. security guarantee would be there in perpetuity. None of those three assumptions have turned out to be correct. So on the Russian end, the Germans have made a very hard shift. Zeitenwende was as much about energy as it was about defense spending. So they are almost entirely off of Russian hydrocarbons now. I think they may be off of Russian hydrocarbons now. They very quickly got those LNG terminals up to buy stuff from Norway and from the US. They're even talking about starting up nuclear plants again, which is a kind of taboo subject in Germany too. So yes, there's a great awareness that the what is it? Handel durch. Dan Krebs always gets mad at me when I pronounce the German wrong, but
Yeah,
this
it's
notion of change, this
Wandel
nation
durch
of
Handel. Yeah, Wandel
there you
durch
go. Thank
Handel.
you,
So change
thank
through
you.
trade. Yeah.
Through trade. I'm a Romance language guy, so I always get the pronunciations of German wrong. But that this was just a completely a flawed way of thinking about grand strategy. So Germany has had to adjust to those three things. It's had to adjust to COVID. It's had to adjust somewhat less to Brexit, which has been an effect as well. And it's also had to deal with this issue now that East Germany is still not fully integrated into the rest of the country. So it's dealing with an awful lot. I think it is fully aware to the reality, at least in the policy circles and at least in Berlin, that Russia is not going to become a quote unquote normal state anytime soon. And while you still don't want to go to war with it, you now have to think about how to deter it again.
Speaking of deterrence, let's turn to the German military. What plans are there for growth in both capability and quantity in the German military?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a debate in Germany, if I've got it right, between exactly where you want to put your assets immediately. There is an argument to build Germany doesn't have a coast guard. It doesn't have a capability quite like that. And as you know, Russia's been playing around with communication cables under the sea and all of this stuff. So there's some argument that maybe that's where you want to go first. There's an argument that you might want to shift to an F-35 or some equally capable fifth generation Air Force. They will be expanding their ground forces. There's talk about a limited form of conscription. The bigger concern is getting these units the equipment that they're going to need. So Rheinmetall is ramping up as quickly as it can, but there's a cap to what it can do because they just don't have the industrial plant. There was talk when we were there that Rheinmetall might actually buy a Volkswagen plant and reconvert it, which if, only someone that understands Germany can understand like what a psychic thing that is, right? Because you're taking one of the backbone industries of Germany, which is the auto industry, and you're now taking it away from civilian production and essentially turning it into defense production. That's a big deal, and I think indicates kind of where Germany is headed. So the idea is kind of what can you ramp up very quickly? What can you ramp up in 2 or 3 years? What will you need to ramp up in 4 or 5? And I think that's going to be driven as much by what kind of kit is available as it will be what are the strategic priorities. At least that was the sense that I got in Berlin.
Yeah. All right. I'll ask you one last very unfair question. Put your mind 5 years into the future and do this trip again, Estonia and Germany. What do you think you're going to find in those countries?
So I'm an historian. We make our living by not predicting anything into the future. I mean, like I said, I do think the political will is there and the money is there. And I think the messages coming from the United States have also spurred exactly what the administration wanted them to spur. It has them fully awake to the reality that they need to do a better job of defending themselves. I may be too optimistic here, but I do think you're going to see some things starting to move in a very good direction. The goal is still deterrence. The goal is not to fight a war with Russia. The goal is not to retake Crimea for Ukraine's benefit. The goal is to protect NATO and protect the NATO zone, and hopefully what Ukraine has in 5 years, protect that zone from any further Russian aggression by a deterrent by denial strategy. And that means your military has to be capable and it has to be credible. And I think that's where people are moving. That's where they want to go. You've seen, despite Brexit, that Britain has been playing quite a role in this as well. We heard that a couple of times, that military to military relations with Britain are good. I heard that when I was in France about a month ago too. And the hope and expectation that as Europe demonstrates that it is a reliable partner, that the United States will continue to play a very important security backstop role. So I'm reasonably optimistic. The Estonians talked about capability, intent, and opportunity for the Russians. So how fast will they rebuild capability? We know their intent. Their intent is to disrupt NATO and prove that Article 5 is not worth the paper it's signed on. And then the key variable, I think, is opportunity. If the United States gets distracted by a major conflict over Taiwan or Iran in the Middle East, it's going to increase that opportunity for Russia. So that's the only variable that I'm worried about. We know Russia's intent. It hasn't changed. It's not going to change. But I think European capability is going to rise in the next 5 years and rise substantially. I hope that's the case anyway.
Well, that's great. To end on a little bit of optimism, on an optimistic note, there's not a lot of optimism flying around in the world today. So that's good to hear that, that at least there's a decent chance that given the trajectory we're on now, that 5 years from now, things will be a little better in terms of European deterrence and capability. Mike, thanks so much for joining me. This has been a fascinating discussion for me. I'm going to name this episode "You Don't Know Until You Go." I like that bumper sticker you threw out there.
I like it.
So
hey, let's meet in Tallinn in 5 years, and if I'm right, let's celebrate with a nice night going out to dinner in Tallinn.
Sounds perfect.
For sure.
Thanks for tuning in to Chain Reaction, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of FPRI. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hamilton, head of Eurasia Research at FPRI. Visit us at fpri.org for more on today's topic and many others in the world of foreign policy and national security. Thanks for listening. See you soon.